isn't it? We are continuing something we started a few weeks back called the Gospel of Nobodies. And what we're doing is we're looking through the lens of Jesus, through his words, through his actions as recorded in the New Testament, to see how Jesus interacted with people in his day who would be considered nobodies. And we're also looking at people of our day who might be considered nobodies. And I'll remind you that I am generalizing quite a bit here, but generalizing, I've always said, somebody has always told me it's never good, and yet it's always helpful. And so when we've talked about nobodies over the last few weeks, we've talked about people who are sick, people who are homeless. Today we're going to talk about demon possession. So it should be quite interesting. Let's start this way first. I always remind people that there are study guides that go along with message series that we do. If you're in person, they're outside in the lobby. They look like this. You can grab one, take it home. If you're online with us, you can download it straight from each sermon series page to use on your own, to use by yourself or with other people, to not just take my word for everything, but to get in the Bible for yourself and to wrestle with these things. And listen, if you need a Bible, take one from this place. If you need one sent to you, direct message us, and we'll make sure that you get one as well. Now, a theme that we're coming back to each week, we started with week number 1, is what a definition of a somebody is. And the way that Jesus modeled it, what we decided was this, that a somebody is one who helps a nobody realize that they are somebody. So no matter how much of a somebody you are, by definition, no matter how much maybe success or fame or friends or whatever it is you have, the true definition of a somebody is only that is if you have helped somebody who feels like a nobody become a somebody. And in the first century Palestine, where Jesus raised and walked the earth, one of the biggest groups of people who are nobodies were those who were seen as demon-possessed. Now, when we talk about demon possession, you have to know that the scriptures in our modern world have demon possession looking in a little bit different way. For instance, when you hear demon possession today, you may think of movies like The Exorcist, right? Now, I watched that once when I was younger, and it weirded me out for weeks. True story, I'm watching it in the middle of the movie. Out of the corner of my eye, something flies across the room in my dining room. And I sat there terrified for about 10 minutes until I finally got up, only to realize that it was a goldfish about this big had jettisoned himself out of the tank and was there flopping in the carpet. But I was too weirded out from The Exorcist to save his life. He lived. But when you see demon possession things, it kind of weirds us out. And so we're a little familiar with those sorts of things. But you need to know this. In the Greco-Roman world, first century world, people believed that demons were everywhere. And some of the demons, they were just annoying. They weren't necessarily evil. They were just like tricksters. Like if you misplaced something, then the demons were playing a trick on you. Not all of them were scary, soul eaters. Sometimes they were just irritating. So some of you might put your family members in that category, but trust me, they're not demons. There's a few different categories I want to talk about today, and the first one is medical conditions, because medical conditions in a first century world were often misunderstood and thought to be demons. For instance, there's a medical condition called sleep paralysis. I don't know if you've seen this or heard of this. But according to WebMD, which is where I got some research on it, sleep paralysis is this being fully conscious and awake, and yet your body is unable to move. You're laying in bed, you may feel pressure, you may feel choking. Essentially, you are lucid, you are aware, but you are paralyzed. And it's terrifying when it happens, and it began to happen to me in 2009. I would wake up one morning and I could not move. And after the first experience, I did what most everybody does, and I went to the internet to research my symptoms. And I've got to tell you, don't go to the internet first, because I was convinced I was either abducted by aliens or something horrible, or maybe a cancer of some sort. I did speak to my primary care doc, though. He assured me that it was just sleep paralysis and that I wasn't abducted by aliens. By the way, I have the propensity to see the fantastic and paranormal in the world because I'm weird that way. He gave me some tips on maybe how to sleep better, some things to do, and certainly said that if these persist, come back and see me, and we'll see if we can do anything about it. And they did. Inevitably, I would find myself awake, laying on my back in the early morning, fully aware of what was going on, fully aware in my mind of what was going on. I mean, logically, it made sense, sleep paralysis. But got to tell you, in the moment that you're in one, all logic goes out the window. And I was afraid. Or better yet, I was terrified. These are often referred to as night terrors. It's easy to see if you had something like this happen to you in the first century before Google and before primary care physicians, it may feel as though a demon is interfering in your life. But there are other things you can read in the Bible and you think, well, that sounds kind of medical as well. Like in Mark's gospel, he tells a story this way. He accounts a man comes, he says to Jesus, "Teacher, I brought you my son who is possessed by a spirit that has robbed him of his speech. Whenever it seizes him, it throws him to the ground, and he foams at the mouth, and he gnashes his teeth, and he becomes rigid." I like this part. "So I asked your disciples to cast out the devil," or the demon. So instead of Jesus, he asked his disciples, and he says, and they couldn't do it. So he went to Jesus himself, and he was healed. Now, when we read that, many of us would read that in a 21st century mind. We would say, this sounds familiar. This sounds more like epileptic seizures, more of a medical condition than literal demons. But remember, we have 2,000 plus years of understanding. And so for a first century person, it felt and seemed like a demon possession. And one of the things I want us to pay attention to here is that when Jesus healed this boy, when Jesus healed people with some disease that they might not understand, he didn't try to explain it to them. Jesus didn't say, hey, one of these days you're going to understand that this is a brain chemistry thing, that there's something not quite right. No, he didn't do that. Instead, he met the person right where they were in the infirmity that they had, encountered them, and healed them. That's what Jesus did. Demon possession in the first century, it included all sorts of things that we would call mental illness. Things like schizophrenia or multiple personality disorders, people hearing voices telling them to do things. I mean, how else would you explain that in the first century before you understood some of the brain chemistry that we do now? You would think it's a demon possession, a spirit of some sort, right? But today, for many of these things, we understand them and we can't treat them successfully medically. But there's also other things that we talk about with demons and some thoughts that we call demons, right? We're going to look at a few of them. And as we do, I want to do this. I tried to come up with an idea of how do we define whether something is a demon or not, because I'm a list person and I'm a category person. And since I'm a pastor, I'm like a list of 3 person. We're taught that in seminary. Always in 3s. And so demons that I'm going to talk about from here moving forward usually have these things happen to a person. A demon creates this destructive behavior in a person. So you look for that. It also makes a person feel trapped in a condition, meaning there's nothing they can do to escape it. And it separates a person from normal living, from their family, from their friends. Those are the 3 things that happens when we have demons in our life. And one of the areas that get labeled a demon quite a bit is the dark side of our psyche. The voices, maybe not audible, but those things that we feel or those things that we hear that whisper to us, that shout at us. Sometimes we talk about them as though there's an angel and a devil on our shoulders, right? We have cartoons of that, and they talk back and forth. Or we say, well, we say it lightheartedly, the devil made me do that. Listen, in the Bible, in the book of James, who's attributed to Jesus' brother, by the way, James says that, remember, when you are saying that you're being tempted, so your angel and your devil, do not say that God is tempting me, because God is never tempted to do wrong, and he never tempts anyone. Temptation comes from your own desires and entices us and drags us away. And these desires, he says, that are within us, they give birth to sinful actions. And when sin is allowed to grow, it gives birth to death. So he's saying, be careful about who you blame your your dark actions on. These desires and these temptations, these voices, they lead us to do all sorts of things that they're opposite of what God would intend for us to do. And sometimes we know it, sometimes we don't know it. And if we label these things as demons, they certainly meet those three criteria. They destroy us, they separate us from other people, they trap us. And so we've got to be careful with these demons that we say that we have. And I just want to talk about a few because I know there's a lot more. And maybe these are familiar to you. Maybe you've heard the voice, metaphorically or not, of these demons, you know. Like if you struggle with addiction, let's say maybe you struggle with alcohol, you hear that voice. Yeah, I know you struggle, but what's one more drink gonna hurt, right? Seriously, nobody's gonna know. You see, the demon of addiction is very real. And it's a disease, that you haven't yet met anybody who can fight it alone, but you can fight it with others, and with help, you can win. There are other dark parts of our minds. People who struggle with chronic depression understand this. Sometimes that depression is a demon that they just can't overcome, and they try to find places of hope, and they try to do the things they're supposed to do, or they maybe even get counseling for it, and yet somewhere there's a voice that speaks to them that says, yeah, I know you're trying to find hope, or I know you're trying to read this Bible because there's hope in it, but there's no hope for you. It's like a demon that speaks. Or maybe it's this one. You know what? Just one more purchase on that credit card that is all maxed out. It's not going to hurt. You've already gone this far. What's one more? We have demons. Now, these demons, they're not necessarily spiritual, literal demons that are attacking us, but they are just as real, and people feel it. And they can neutralize our impact with our families and our impact for God, and it sucks the life out of us, and it robs of our joy and enslaves us to the point sometimes of death. These personal demons love to fill our minds with anxiety and with doubt. They whisper things like this: you're not good enough. You're such a fake. You're so fat. You're stupid. You're unlovable. You don't deserve anything good. You know, these personal demons, and they love to get us doing self-destructive things like cutting and not eating, and maybe even taking our own lives. They love it when we hold on to hate and resentment and bitterness. And when we listen to those demons, they take up residence and they create pain. Long periods of pain. Now, some of the things, though, in the Bible, especially the New Testament, when you read it, you can look at that and say, you know what, that was a physical illness, or that was a dark part of somebody's psyche. But then you come across those passages where you're like, I don't know what to do about that. You know, is it okay to say creepy? And yeah, that's just creepy. That's weird. Literal demons. That brings us back to the scripture that you heard just a little bit from Carol in Luke chapter 8. The story begins this way. Jesus and his disciples are crossing the Sea of Galilee on a boat. And almost any time you read the Bible and you see Jesus and his disciples get in a boat, just get prepared because things get weird. They get in the boat, a storm comes, Jesus calms the storm, but the disciples are still nervous, they're freaked out. They make it across the Sea of Galilee, which, by the way, is this huge, huge lake, to a place called the Gerasenes. By the way, the Gerasenes, it's Gentile country. It's not a place where Jews lived. It's not a place where they went. Remember, ancient Jewish people, they were set apart. They completely, as much as they could, try to be separated from other people. They are there in this land full of people to them who are nobodies, and they meet a man who was a nobody. And as you heard it earlier, it said this, that they arrived in the region of the Gerasenes, across the lake from Galilee. And as Jesus was climbing out of the boat, a man who was possessed by demons came out to meet him. For as long as he had been homeless and naked, living in the tombs outside the town. Another verse forward, it said the spirit had often taken control of the man, even when he was placed under guard and put him in chains and shackles. He would simply break them, and he rushed into the wilderness completely under the demon's power. Now, this story is also recorded in another gospel. Mark's account of it adds another detail that this man was harming himself. Mark said that day and night he wandered among the burial caves and in the hills, howling and cutting himself with sharp stones. I mean, how do you picture this guy after reading that or hearing that? Maybe crazy eyes, matted hair. I always envision him with a gnarly beard, an unkept beard. He was scary. He was dirty. He was bloody. Strong as an ox, and he couldn't even live in the city, in the place that he grew up in. He couldn't live amongst his own people. He was an outcast from the people. So from Jewish perspective, he was the epitome of the nobody of even the nobodies. And yet Jesus shows up. And then it says, as soon as he saw Jesus, this is the man, he shrieked and he fell down in front of him. And then he screamed, "Why are you interfering with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? Please, I beg you, don't torture me." For Jesus had already commanded the evil spirits to come out of him. Jesus then demanded to him, "What is your name? Tell me your name." "Legion," he said. And you may have heard that name. There's movies about demon stuff with that name, Legion, because it's a reference to the man was filled with many, many demons. The demons keep begging Jesus not to send them to the bottomless pit. And there just so happened to be a large herd of pigs feeding on the hillside nearby. By the way, pigs to a Jewish community were, well, they're not nobodies, but you don't eat them. They are no-nos. There's a herd of pigs there. The demons begged to let them into their pigs, so Jesus gave them permission. And the demons came out of the man, entered the pigs, and the entire herd plunged down the steep hillside into the lake and drowned. Now, there are people, there's a lot we can take from this, but there's this idea in the world, not exclusive to Christianity, but to people in general, that there's this power back and forth between good and evil, light and dark. And often this belief is that these powers of good and evil, that there's an equality to them. That's where we get this image of a little angel and a little devil talking to us, that they are in the world, but they have equal power. But in this story, what we see is that the power of darkness has no standing whenever the light shows up. The power of evil does not have any standing when good shows up. And it says Jesus just steps foot on the land, and this legion of demons drops to the ground, whimpering in fear and begging for mercy without Jesus even doing anything. I think we're supposed to see this. In every case, when we find demons speaking in the gospel, you need to know that they're afraid. They're terrified of Jesus, because ultimately God's power is so much greater than the power of darkness that these demons are terrified in his presence. It isn't a battle of equals. You know, Jesus, who we claim to follow, should you choose to, that Jesus claims us in our baptisms, and he says to us, like the song we sang, "You are a child of mine. You belong to me, and you come under my protection." Which brings me back to sleep paralysis. You see, I had a few of these, 3 or 4 of them. And after a while, I kind of got used to it. But then one night at about 3 in the morning, these always happen to me, by the way, when I wake up. But about 3 in the morning, I had another episode happen. But this one was a little bit different. It was a little familiar in that all of a sudden I was paralyzed. But instead of sleeping on my back this time, I was sleeping on my stomach. I had a little less stomach back then. Sleeping on my stomach, I was frozen, and yet I was certain that somebody sat down on the bed next to me. And before I could think or move, that bed-sitting movement changed to feeling like somebody was sitting on me, on my lower back. And then it also felt like there were hands on my shoulders pushing me into my bed, and I felt as though I was being suffocated into my pillow. It felt like somebody was there, but there was nobody there. Again, sleep paralysis can be terrifying, and I knew this. I've always prided myself on being a very logical, intellectual person. And even in this moment, I was thinking about it. I even thought about it in the moment. But it didn't matter because I felt paralyzed. Not just paralyzed, I felt like I was being held down. I feel like someone was trying to kill me. And so I laid there and I tried to speak. I tried to scream. Unsuccessfully. I tried to move again. In fact, I can remember the only thing I could move was my pinky. It was this one. And I can remember thinking to myself, I could just detach this pinky and have it crawl over and wake somebody up next to me, and it'd be all right. But it wouldn't. And so I sat there and time stood still. And I do remember still today tears welling up in my eyes and rolling down the bridge of my nose. And all I could do then was try to whisper, this time successfully. And all I said was, "Help me, Jesus." And it stopped. Stopped instantly. And I sat up in bed and I caught my breath and I surveyed the room, and I was a little weirded out. But nothing was unusual in the room. Everything was ordinary. The night was still. Everyone in my house was still sleeping peacefully, but I wasn't peaceful. I made my way through the room, and I exited the door, and I went to go downstairs to the kitchen to get a glass of water. And about halfway down the stairs, I was greeted by my dog. This dog at the time, his name was Duke, and he was a boxer, about this tall, about as big and strong as you can get, and yet also like the wiggliest puppy personality that you could get. The type that when you walk into his presence, he lets you know, and yet on this particular day, halfway down the steps, he would not come to me. He stood at the bottom of the steps with his hair all sticking up, barking at me and growling, and he ran off to my office, which made me freak out more. Now, I cannot tell you with certainty what happened that night. My logical brain tells me that this was an episode of sleep paralysis combined with my tendencies to see paranormal and weird things in the world. But I got to tell you, the other side of me feels like I felt darkness that night. That I felt evil that night, and the only thing that stopped it was the name of Jesus. And because of that name, I've never had another one. I tell you, I rarely tell this story because, let's face it, it sounds bizarre, and it sounds weird, and it sounds incredible. It sounds a little bit crazy, and I don't share it much because I don't want people to think that I'm bizarre and not credible and a little crazy. But I can't ignore it. And because I can't ignore it, I've had to come to grips with what I believe about these things. And so I want to end by telling you what I believe. I believe this, that if you believe in Jesus and you believe that Jesus cast out demons, then you have to believe that demons exist. Now, I also believe that you're not to give demons too much credit in the world, and you're not to go searching them out. Like I said earlier, strange things happen in the world that often have an explanation if we just go searching for it. But on a rare occasion, things happen that have no explanation. Good things happen, we call it miracles, that have no explanation. Dark things happen that defy explanation. They can't be scientifically proven. They don't make sense. And when they don't make sense, I've discovered that in my own power, I can do nothing against these things. I don't have the right faith or the right smarts or anything to make these attacks go away. Something forcibly, something incredible happens in those moments. And for me, the only thing that I have learned that helps is to either with force or the whisper, just say, I belong to Jesus. That's all I've got. I don't have any power to do anything, but I believe my master has the power to do all things. And when you look in the New Testament, the demons in the New Testament, Jesus was always infinitely more powerful than they were, and they were terrified of him. So I would just say to surrender to Jesus and call on his name and be safe. Now, one last thing to finish the story is this. I wanted you to notice the ending of this story. The man is free. He's free from the demons. His countenance has changed. He seems in his right mind. Jesus and his disciples are getting ready to head back across the sea, back to their side, the Jewish side, where the somebodies are at. And Luke says this. He says that the man who had been freed from the demons, he begged to go with them, begged to go with Jesus and his disciples. But Jesus sent him home, saying, no, go back to your family. Remember, this had destroyed his family unit. Go back to your family, be restored, and tell them everything God has done for you. And so the man, he went all through his town proclaiming the great things Jesus had done for him. And here's what I want us to take away. Long before the Apostle Paul, who the church accredits as the greatest person to ever start the church movement into the Gentile world, meaning the non-Jewish world. Long before the Apostle Paul did his missionary journeys, this man was the first missionary to a Gentile world, and he was a Gentile, a nobody of the nobodies. Naked, stark, raving mad, an outcast. And Jesus made it clear to him that he was a somebody and he had work to do. Go, he says, and tell your people the good things that God has done. Listen, I believe that if God could see it fit to go through a storm and travel for hours on this lake to a forbidden place and find one person that everybody thought was a lunatic and cast out an evil spirit and give him a new life, if he can do it for that man, he can do it for you. And he can do it for me. And that's the gospel of the nobodies. And remember, the word gospel means good news, right? It's the good news of the nobodies. In the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Amen.